At Park Bank, we believe drive and ambition come from the deepest parts of who we are. We view achievement not as a selfish pursuit, but as a way to improve the lives of our clients, our associates, and our neighbors. We believe ultimately ambition is driven by the heart. We've grown considerably since our start as a small community bank on Park Street, and yet we've always understood that our success depends on the success of others. Our story of ambition starts right here, in the hearts of every member of our team. Our backgrounds may be different, but our values are the same. We believe in giving more than we take, that we are more successful together, and that collaborative spirit and drive are inherent in all of us. Some of our greatest pride comes from collaborating with local entrepreneurs to build vibrant businesses that make Dane County unique. We take the time to build lasting relationships and provide exceptional service grounded in shared values. Together, we bring ambition to fruition. We're privileged to work with local causes, volunteering our time and resources to make a difference in the lives of people who make our home a place unlike anywhere else. By giving back, we all move forward. As far as we've come at Park Bank, we don't ever stop at good enough. We're always looking for the next challenge, the next opportunity, the next accomplishment. Together, we can get there, anywhere, from right here. Park Bank. Let's get to next.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for deciding to use your valuable time to spend some time with myself and the three other gentlemen that you see on the screen. My name is Rashad Cobb, and I'm going to serve as your moderator for the last panel here at the beautiful conference that Madison 365 has hosted once again. And this particular session is a protest to policy, the next step in systematic change. Before we get into the discussion, the Q&A, I guess I want to just give you a little bit about myself. Originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but now residing in Green Bay, Wisconsin. I work as the Director of Equity and Community Initiatives for the Greater Green Bay Community Foundation. Really, one of my roles is to just really be the eyes and ears to the nonprofit community, and then also ensuring that the work that we do here at the Community Foundation is equitable in every way possible. And then again, just being available to the community to hear their needs and make sure that we respond to them as a community foundation. Outside of work, one of the things that I do as a volunteer is I serve as a police and fire commissioner for the city of Green Bay. I've been in that role for about 2 years, appointed by our mayor, Eric Ginrich. And as I said to him at the time of the appointment, it's probably one of the 5 most important things that I've done by choice with my life. So I really, really appreciate that honor. And that is how I present to you today from those 2 roles. But what I want to do is maybe take some time here to introduce our panelists, since they really are going to be the stars of this show. Up first, we have Mr. Savion Castro. Mr. Castro is a Madison native by way of Beloit, where he graduated from MMSD at Madison La Follette High School and attended UW-Madison as a People Scholar. He graduated from UW-Madison having studied sociology, economics, and African American history. And he's been a civil rights advocate and policy researcher for over a decade, having served on multiple local government committees working to eliminate juvenile incarceration and dismantle the school to prison pipeline, also working as a youth mentor and tutor. Savion was also elected as the youngest ever to serve on the Madison Metropolitan School District Board of Education in 2020, and currently serves as the Board of Education Vice President. He also teaches as an instructor of record for First Wave Hip Hop Arts Program, and also a master's student in education psychology and data program. Welcome, Mr. Castro. Up next, we have David Aguayo, who was born and raised in the Madison area, as well as educated. An alumnus of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Mr. Aguayo received his bachelor's degree in legal studies and criminal justice. Currently, he is the public policy manager for the Greater Madison Chamber of Commerce, where he heads all advocacy and election matters. Previously, David serves as the Latino Coalition Director for the state of Wisconsin on the Biden for President campaign. He lives downtown in Madison with his wife, newborn daughter, and 2 Siberian Huskies. Thank you and welcome. And then last but not least, we have Chief Sean Barnes. Chief Barnes was hired as the Madison Police Department's Chief of Police by the Police and Fire Commission in February of 2021. Chief Barnes is a nationally recognized leader in crime reduction and community police relations. He was previously the Director of Training and Professional Development for the Civilian Office of Police Accountability in Chicago, Illinois. Chief Barnes was the Deputy Chief of Police in Salisbury, North Carolina as well, and a captain with the Greensboro Police Department, where he began his career as a patrol officer in the fall of 2000. Chief Barnes was honored as a National Institute of Justice Leeds Leeds Scholar for using innovative technology to reduce crime, and is a council member on the National Police Foundation's Council of Policing Reforms in Race. The council is a nonpartisan initiative which uses research and evidence to consider and offer recommendations to resolve some of the most pressing issues regarding police reform. Chief Barnes attended Elizabeth City State University, where he received a BA in History Pre-Law, and the University of Cincinnati, Ohio, where he received a master's degree in criminal justice. And then he's recently earned a PhD in leadership studies from North Carolina Agricultural and Technology University. I believe that's North Carolina A&T. Mr. Barnes is married, or Chief Barnes is married to Dr. Stephanie Dans Barnes and has the two have 3 children, Ashley, Aiden, and Addison. So thank you all for joining us today and allowing me to read a little bit about you all. But really just wanted to kind of jump right into the conversation here with the topic being protest to policy. Can you maybe one of you jump in and talk about perhaps the intersection between the work that you do and policy and policing? Policy and protesting.
Sure, I'll start. First of all, thank you, Rashid or Rashad. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly for the bio, and thank you for Madison 365 for having me and allowing me to share some of my thoughts. Part of my role and my responsibility as chief of police is to listen to the voice of our community. And when people who are in elected positions or positions of leadership in government do not listen to the voice of the people, it will be heard through protests. This has been the history of our country, and it certainly has been the history of the city where I hail, Greensboro, North Carolina. Greensboro is the home of the sit-in movements, February 1, 1960, when 4 college students, 4 young people from my alma mater, North Carolina A&T State University, sat down at the Woolworth counter so that they could be heard, that they wanted to be treated fairly. And so this has been the history of our nation, and it will certainly continue to be the history of Madison as long as I'm here. My standpoint is we do nothing to prohibit free speech in any way, shape, or form, whether we agree or disagree. That's really not our what we're here for. But what we try to do is to listen, to understand what those issues are that are causing the protests. And so it's very important to note that in 2020, our nation saw a variety of protests after the killing of George Floyd, and it made police departments all over the country reevaluate themselves. And I think this should probably happen before protests. And so my role as a chief of police is to manage protests, to ensure that people can protest in a way that's peacefully, to make sure that we, number one, are protecting the lives of people, because sometimes we do have counter protesters. For those persons who do not know what that means that sometimes people don't want to hear what other people are trying to express, and they show up with the express purposes of disrupting that. And sometimes, like in Charlottesville, Virginia, you will remember that, they show up and they hurt people. In 2020, I was the deputy chief of police in Salisbury, and we had counter protesters, and they showed up and they fired a weapon on the ground at someone with the intention to hurt someone, we're able to take that person quickly into custody because of our presence. So sometimes when police officers are there, we're not there to prohibit the protests, but we're there to protect people. And we certainly believe that here in Madison, and we stand willing and able to protect everyone's First Amendment rights.
Thank you for that, Mr. Castro. How about you?
Yeah, thank you. So before I was elected to the board, I did a lot of community organizing work and organized quite a few protests here in Madison throughout the Black Lives Matter movement since I was essentially a junior or senior in high school. And so in a lot of ways, I still consider myself a protester. And I think now as a policymaker and in an elected position, I think the role of protests helps expand our imagination for what's possible, for what is possible in terms of the society we want to live in. And as someone who studies policy and makes policy, it's how do we translate that into action? How do we codify that into our laws? And so we have to intimately listen to the voices and demands of protesters in terms of what types of society that they are demanding. What does a just society look like? And translating that into action at the policy level. The school district in particular has been the source of a lot of protests when it comes to the racial injustices that we see in our school system. And in many ways, we have to be open to accountability to that fact. And so in my role, it's to occupy both sides as a role of someone who is a protester and a policymaker.
I appreciate that. What about you, Mr. Arguello?
Thanks for the introduction, first of all, Rashad, and echo Chief Barnes and saying thanks to Madison 365 for hosting this. In particular, this discussion that we're having today right now, it's very important. So thank you for putting this together. The intersection you asked between our jobs and protest and policy. I would say that my job is pretty unique in that as head of advocacy, I'm able to kind of steer the direction of which our organization puts their resources into advocacy. And while it has to, we are a chamber of commerce, so the advocacy is business focused. But if we can make a point for something to, relate to business, then we make those points, take it up with the board, and they either approve it or don't. So what I've been through and taking my lived experience, my kind of knowledge of certain backgrounds and institutions, used, the position I was in to my advantage. In conjunction with our minority chambers, the Latino Chamber of Commerce, having, the protests at the Capitol for driver's license and, just the day without the Mexican or the day without the Latino, just those types of protests and, being part of that and now being in a position where I'm able to kind of effectuate policy or change. We were able to put in, some policy points into our advocacy agenda for immigrants and for driver's license for immigrants and to change the federal policy for immigrants so that they could receive driver's license. And this is all through stuff that we've, heard here in Madison through the protests, through what we're hearing with our partners. And, we were out in DC just last year and we advocated to our federal delegation on the issue of federal immigration to, support federal skilled worker immigration reform to grow and retain talent, but also, removing state and local licensing barriers tied to federal immigration status. So all of these things that we could do to kind of bring and help alleviate some of the issues that our community is having here. So, in a nutshell, it's really just kind of to Savion's point, what is the community demanding? What are they asking? What are we hearing? And then using our platforms to bring those to light.
I appreciate that contribution from all three of you. And you kind of led into something I wanted to go to next, which is actually referencing back to something that Savion said, which was you spoke about how protests can be the start of imagining policy change. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. when we think about just the role of protests moving our nation forward, a lot of things that a lot of policies or ways we live that people initially write off or thought was not possible is now possible, and we live with today. And I think the history of our country, though progress is never linear, I think we've backtracked in a few key ways. And progress is never something we should never take for granted, because it can easily be taken away. But a lot of the things that we now enjoy today, such as the right to vote as a Black person, at what point in time, a lot of people were skeptical that would never happen, but it was through the role of protests that we achieved the right to vote. We're still working for desegregated schools. A lot of people at one point in time thought that was not possible. They couldn't even imagine what an integrated school would look like. And so when I think about the civil rights struggles of today, we're talking about academic achievement, or when we're talking about dismantling the school to prison pipeline, a lot of folks can't imagine a school without suspensions or expulsions, for example. What does the role of protest in terms of just trying to broaden our imaginations of what a society can look like? Because I think we all live in the status quo, right? And the status quo is stubborn, and it is very good at tricking us into thinking this is the way it's always been for a reason and we can't change it. And I think protest is the cure to that kind of sticky and stubborn status quo.
Appreciate that contribution. In the lead up to today, again, the four of us took some time to connect and just and to network a little bit to ensure that this conversation would be as rich as we want it to be. And during that time, Chief Barnes, you made a really good point around the idea of people, individuals protesting about things that may already be on the books. Can you talk about that a little bit, and the importance of that particular potential issue?
Absolutely. During the George Floyd protest, there were some demands, I think, that came out from that protest. The Police Executive Research Forum actually put together a list of what people were actually asking for as a result of that particular incident. And I want to share some of those with you. The first was prohibiting chokeholds. The second was revising use of force policies, requiring use of force reporting, duty to intervene policies, an end to no-knock search warrants, removal of SROs from schools, mental health for police officers, the implementation of body-worn cameras, pre-hire psychological tests, and alternatives to mental health response that do not require police. And so it's important to note that oftentimes before a protest, I think it's important to sit down with the policymakers and say, what are you doing about this problem? And give them an opportunity to demonstrate that. And so I wrote an article, or I did some writing on this about a year ago. And I said, well, if this is what the research shows that the community is asking for, the nation is asking for, how does my department stand up to that? In prohibiting chokeholds, we've had that policy on the book for almost 20 years. And indeed, in most state trainings where I came from in North Carolina, it's not even taught. Although in Minneapolis, it was taught. So it was something that people were asking for that most states didn't even have on the books anyway. It's unfortunate that it was on the books in Minneapolis. Use of force policies. The policy that we have is constantly reviewed. They have expiration dates, and they're always reviewed for making sure that they are adhering to best practices. Use of force reporting. Our department does a quarterly report. We do a monthly report, and we do an annually report. Our monthly report is almost 54 pages. And so certainly we're ahead of the curve there. Duty to intervene. We've had that on the books for some time. No-knock search warrants. We do apply for no-knock search warrants, but we don't execute no-knock search warrants. And I will be having a press conference later, hopefully early next month, to talk about my stance on no-knock search warrants. Removal of SROs. This is a hot button topic. I won't shake the beehive too much, but this is one of those things where people wanted SROs removed from school. And indeed, that happened here in Madison. But what we don't know is what the impact of that is going to be. What's the plan? Most departments did not have one. Mental health for police officers, we do that here. We actually have every officer, every employee actually has a day to meet with a clinician. In fact, mine is next Friday. I have my session, and we do that once a year in accordance with a mental health check-in. Body-worn cameras. People want accountability. They want to see what happens. We do not have body-worn cameras. However, I'm working now to do a pilot test study for that. And there's a very important vote on that on Tuesday. If it passes, then I have an opportunity to experiment to see what does body-worn cameras mean for Madison and what questions can we answer. Pre-hire psychological tests, we do that. An alternative to mental health response. We've done that for over 8 years with our mental health officers. And indeed, we now have a CARES program where we have people going out to those low-level mental health calls. So that's an example of how protest and what people want and what they ask for can be adhered to.
Thank you for that. And also in our prep, David, I thought one of the things that you really alluded to that was important is that not all protests are related to social injustices that are going on. You talked about some of the protests that you were involved in, specifically related to schools in that area. Can you talk a little bit about that experience and the change that came about from that, from using your voice in that way?
Yeah. So, protest takes on different shapes, different forms. One could even argue that us being here on this platform is a protest to what we, believe we want to see. And just having a conversation is a form of protest to then effectuate change in policy. Something that I've also been a part of was the James Madison Memorial Renaming Committee. And, we heard from the community that they wanted this name changed, and a committee was formed. And there was a citizens committee, which, I'm not quite sure of the exact number of folks that were on there, 12, 13. But we, ultimately decided on changing the name from James Madison to Vel Phillips. That recommendation was passed up to the school board, which they unanimously approved. So in that sense, it's protests that, you wouldn't really think that it's a protest, but in the grand scheme of things, it really is. And kind of reshaping, how Madison wants to view certain historical characters.
Thank you for that. One of the other things go ahead, please.
No, and I think that is a great point, because we're speaking at a time when trust and confidence in public institutions across America at all levels of government is at an all-time low. And even non-governmental agencies such as the press, trust and confidence are at an all-time low. And I think a reason for that is that there is not a responsiveness to protests, for example. And I think the example that David just highlighted was an example of a responsiveness to protests and hearing voices in the community. And that's just one small example, but a lot of those go a long way into rebuilding that trust and confidence, or not even rebuilding, but building a new trust and confidence, because I think the old order of trust and confidence in some of these public institutions was at the detriment to a lot of the lives of people who look like us, right? So building a new trust and confidence.
I really appreciate that addition.
Can I just come back on the backs of that? So, I really appreciate what Savion said, and I've been saying this since 2020. The 2020 protests were about more than the police. If you think it was just about the police, you have missed the entire point of it. And he's exactly right. It was about a distrust in government and a distrust in a system that people don't see it working the same for everyone. And people were tired of it. And so I did not get offended by anything I heard in 2020 because I was actually listening to what people were saying as they were marching. And so I really appreciate Savion kind of bringing that point home during this very important conversation.
Thank you for that. You know, we also talked a little bit about the reactionary nature of protests, and I'm not using that word in a negative term at all. But it's that initial reaction that people have to something that they've experienced or are experiencing, and sometimes people may not know how to go about taking that feeling they have that causes them to protest and working the system, right? Because there's a system, and you have to kind of know the rules of it to get to the point of affecting policy. And so, have any of you worked with individuals that you've seen leading protests and help them begin those steps of working with their local elected officials and others to get policy change? You know, that's one of the things that Green Bay in the summer of 2020 experienced the biggest protests in the city's history. It was actually a beautiful thing. It was well organized, it was well attended. People felt heard. And one of the things I kept thinking to myself as I watched this really young lady organize and lead this was, does she know how to take all of this energy that's here and begin to have the long-lasting change that she wants to have? And so there's been some attempts on my part to connect with her around that to try to help get her connected to the right individuals to do that. So, but in your lives and in your work, have you had any experience with helping individuals who may lead protests or be involved in protests begin to understand the systems and what it takes to move towards policy change?
Yeah, real quick, I'll jump in and say that I have talked to a lot of individuals in the community saying that, you know, we need to hear your voice more often because, to be honest, I love that I heard your voice here, but we need to hear it more often because, as I said earlier, progress isn't guaranteed, and some of the gains we've made aren't guaranteed to stay. You know, there's always a pushback. You know, there's the civil rights movement, and then there's the pushback. There was Reconstruction, and then there was Jim Crow. There's always that pushback. And so I'm always suspicious whenever there's a claim that progress has been made. And so I always say, you know, we've got to stay persistent and consistent in the way we advocate, but also as a leader in an institution, we have to make the inputs to policy, you know, opportunities to give input on policy more accessible for people because, you know, historically it has not been accessible and the input has not always been widely sought.
Do you want to have any follow-up to that one, or you want me to move to the next question?
I can take it's kind of a different approach to the question if I'm understanding it correctly. But, you know, after the Biden campaign, so on the Biden campaign was coalition building, bridging communities together and kind of just moving one kind of voice within the coalition, the Latino coalition forward and making sure that was heard. So, you know, having had that coalition building experience and just off the heels of a presidential election, I founded Aguayo LLC, which is, you know, a political consulting firm really tailored and aimed at first-time candidates and candidates of color. So really just, you know, using that, you know, when I spoke to folks and, you know, potential candidates, they wanted to see change in their community. They wanted to see, you know, certain things happen that, you know, weren't necessarily happening. So kind of helping them, you know, understand what's happening at the local level, how you can get plugged in, the resources that are around, and how you can run for office, and really just guiding them so that, you know, they can be the change that they want to see. So in a sense, helping those folks kind of understand the political climate and make a decision to run for office.
Sure. With that kind of goes into what I was going to ask next, is with the power structures making it difficult for those who are often disadvantaged by the system to have opportunities to change it or to make more equitable changes. In what ways can we, or have you created space for those most harmed by inequities to access their voice and to share their ideas? Chief Barnes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying I can take this one if you like.
Yeah, go ahead, and then we'll go to Chief Barnes right after.
So I think just recently, Kaleem Care put together a fantastic event at the Capitol, where we were hosted by Representative Sheila Stubbs. And really what he was doing was creating that space, bringing together Black and Brown students from West High School into the assembly chamber, a room that's reserved for just, a room where policy is made and laws are passed, and it holds high importance. So all he did was bring folks into that room. We had a conversation with the state representative. We had some representatives from the police there, from the Central District. The commanders were all there, and it was a really nice event, and really just opening up the door and showing them, there are different paths in life. And if you're interested in doing something like this, and really just creating community within the Black and Latino folks. So, I think it was something as simple as gathering a group at the Capitol, listening to their stories, and that was impactful in itself and helping to create change.
Chief Barnes?
This question really speaks to me one of the tenets of procedural justice, which is voice. How do I, as a leader, give voice to people who would not have it otherwise? I will tell you that is the best part of my job. I will repeat that again. That is the best part of my job. I give out my phone number. I answer it. I talk to people. I answer emails. I visit people. I sit on your couch. I think that my responsibility as a leader is to give voice to those persons who would not have had it had I not been sitting in this seat. And I got to tell you, when someone calls me and says, Chief, I know you're busy, but I put it down and I listen to it, because I think that's very, very important, whether it's speeding on their residential neighborhood or whether it's someone having an issue with the break-in. Hey, the cops aren't coming to take this report because they can do it. I want to talk to someone. Well, let me see if I can get someone out there for you. That is the best part of my job. That is leadership. Leadership exists to serve others. We're not money-making machines. We're not here for accolades. We're not here for awards. We are here to serve others. So one of the first things that I did as chief of police is that I established my Chief Youth Advisory Council. And that is comprised of about 12 young people who are recently graduated or still in school. I partnered with American Family. We give them a stipend. They come to meetings and they help advise me on communication, on things that are going on with the youth. What's the best way to connect with people? What's the best use of my time? How do I listen to their voices? They've told me everything from understanding why kids steal cars to understanding that bus systems in disadvantaged neighborhoods don't run like they do other places. They see that when they want to go to the mall. They talked about, transportation and how tough it is. They talked about businesses who overcharge them and their kids. You have $10. You want to go do this activity, and by the time you finish, you may have enough for a soda, but now you can't do any more activities, and now people want you to leave. And I've learned so much from them, and not just TikTok, by the way. I've learned a lot from them. And one of the things that they told me in our very first meeting is I want all the answers. And they said, this is hard work. And they said, Chief, you just have to be patient. And so I think about that every day when I come to work. Sometimes you just have to be patient and do the work.
Savion, did you have any follow-up?
I think it's what both the chief and David have said about going to the people versus making the people come to you. I agree with 100%. And then the other thing is we can't waste anyone's time. So we got to have that follow through, right? So if they give us valuable input and having already been harmed by the system, one, thank you for agreeing to talk to us again after system's already harmed you. Two, we have to follow through. We can't be wasting anyone's time.
Thank you. What I want to do for a second here is just take a quick detour. And we've got our first question from the audience, which is it feels like we keep hearing the same names leading various movements. How can we inject new voices? Do any of you have any ideas or strategies or solutions for infusing new voice into these important conversations?
Yeah, real quick. Having this opportunity to serve on the school board, it's certainly a position of leadership, but it's also a position where I can step aside and let other voices, shine. I forget who said it, but a quote was, "Don't be a voice for the hopeless, just pass the microphone." And some of the most impactful investments I think we've made as a board is investing in student voice and student leadership in the district, and providing students with a social justice curriculum and language at all levels, so they can not only advocate for themselves, but advocate for their homes, families, and communities.
I love it. Absolutely love it. I mean, that kind of makes me think to a lesser extent about some things or philosophies I have, which is really just trying to get out of the way, bringing young people into some of the things I'm involved with, kind of showing them the ropes, and then getting out of the way and letting them do their work in those spaces as well. David, did you have any thoughts on that as well? About how can we inject new voices?
Yeah, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, but it's run for office. Just take that step. No one says that you can't be that new leader. So it's really just take that leap of faith, use that platform to project your ideas, or just find folks that share the same views as you, and build a platform for them. And I think running for office is a very easy way to inject some new voices.
And in your work, do you have programs to assist young people with that? Because from the outside, that can look intimidating.
Yeah, I mean, not through my daytime job. It's not a resource that we would provide. But there are other groups out there dedicated to just that. Adelante, for example, is a very prominent group here in Madison that helps people of color run for office.
Okay. What's the name of that group again?
Adelante, which in Spanish means forward.
Thank you for that. And then Chief Barnes, I'm sorry I cut you off. You were about to contribute.
No, I think it was definitely a great segue. So I'll give a little bit of pushback on that, because the truth of the matter is, when you are leading anything, that is powerful, and there is some power in that. And where in America have people ever given up power? And we have to acknowledge that. We also have to acknowledge that as leaders, our first obligation is the succession plan. When I know my time here is done, is when I know that we can pick the next chief, or the police fire commission, I should say, can pick the next chief by putting names in a hat or drawing straws, making sure people understand what the community want and can take your place. And so that question to me speaks to the fact that there are some people who are in leadership positions, and it's time to step aside and give other people an opportunity, or at least develop other people to take your place. I'm from the South, and we have our civil rights heroes and leaders, and they tend to stay that way until they die. And so then there's just, who's going to be next? And I got to tell you, that won't be my case. I'm trying to develop my staff, everyone from some of the young rookie officers to some captains that I've seen with, really great ideas and a bright future ahead of them. And so the first step to doing that, to answer that question, is to develop the people who are around you and make sure that they can take your place. And then the second thing is we have to think about, what does community mean? We said that quite a few times during the course. And I would just submit to you that there are always two levels of community. There's your district level of community who may want one thing, and then it's your community as a whole. And so you have to know, who are you talking to? Who are you leading? Are you talking to the district level community, or are you talking to your community as a whole, or your community proper? I think it begins there.
Thank you for that. And one thing I forgot to ask you earlier is you talked about some of the laws that were already on the books What is the easiest way for a person who doesn't know how to navigate where to find laws to find out about the laws that are in the book at the police department? Let's just say for the department that you lead.
Absolutely. We are certainly committed to transparency. You can find any policy that we have online. Can't find our tactics and kind of how we navigate dangerous spaces, but you can find our policies online. We also have a professional standards and internal affairs section. So they don't just take complaints. They're a professional standard. So if you ever have a question about a professional standard in the police department, you can go onto our website, look at my picture. At the bottom of my picture, there's a link to it, and you can email them if you want. You can call, write, or just stop by, and their responsibility and role is to answer those questions about professional standards. But I will tell you, no one does. They either assume because they've seen it in LA or Minnesota or North Carolina that it's the same everywhere. And we have to realize we do not have a national police force here in America. Policing is very localized, even though we should be policing in a way that makes us the national model. It's part of my vision statement. But every police department will do something different, you know, whether it's the town of Madison, Fitchburg, or wherever you may be, or even Green Bay. We may wear the same color uniform. Our badges may even look the same. But I will tell you, when you dig deep and you look in those policies, sometimes they're vastly different depending on the organization. And I understand that that can be very confusing for people.
Thank you very much. Savion, I know that you have to leave a little bit earlier, so I wanted to give you a chance to leave us with some parting wisdom before you do so.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know the title of this panel was Protest to Policy, but I will throw a quick wrench in there in that I think protest is also an art form, and art is important because when it comes to social change, broadly speaking, there is protest, policy, and culture. And in my experience, having studied policy in multiple domains, specializing in education, I think I can safely say that culture eats policy for breakfast every day. I think systems and policies are ultimately enforced by people. And if we don't have the right people to implement or enforce those policies, the policy is just words on paper. So I think we really have to think deeply about what's the culture of the society we want to live in, and whether we have a culture that reinforces policies or kind of bucks the policies too. And so I think we have to really just respect protests as an art form, as a tool to broaden our imaginations, and to kind of read between the lines of what protesters are saying sometimes.
Yeah, and you said having the right people. Can you give me one characteristic of what a right person would be?
I think when we're talking about systems level work, I think we need individuals who understand that we need systems to fit the people and not people to fit the systems.
Okay.
Or the point of the system is to serve the people, and it's not the other way around. We, you know, especially in education, where we historically have had a one size fits all standard, and what I'm trying to change with the mindset thinking is that no, we shouldn't make our students fit the system. We need to make our system fit the people. We can't have such a rigid system where it doesn't just fit the needs. Then I think we get into some institutional drift.
Thank you. Really, really appreciate that. And I think you kind of helped me get into the next question I wanted to ask.
Take care.
Yeah, you as well. Was really, again, it almost, the way that this is presented is almost like protest to policy, voila. People protest and then policy change happens. We know that's not true. And, you know, he said that there's culture involved. And David, you alluded to the fact that people can run for office. And Chief Barnes, you talked about people can be in touch with you and voice themselves outside of protests. Are there any pieces of that strategic puzzle that are missing or that you think are essential to help individuals and communities move from protest to policy? Are there other things that people could or should be doing?
I think accountability. How are you being accountable So the community, and how is the community being accountable to government? I do think it's more of a two-way street. I think the argument that, hey, we didn't just show up and protest. We tried to meet with you. We tried to find your policy. We wanted to understand if this could happen here, if it could not happen here, and you were not responsive. In other words, you were not accountable to me. And this is the result of that. And I think that's the piece that I think is sometimes missing in the protest to policy, is that really evaluation or measurement of where is it that we want to go. And then when there is accountability, the most important part about policy is, what are the impacts of this policy? How is this policy going to impact the community? There's always an opportunity cost to everything that you do or choose not to do. And so if you choose to remove SROs from schools, what will be the impact of that? It may be what you want in policy, but what's the impact of that? And so that question should be answered before the policy is implemented. And that is never the case when you're talking about it. In my career of being in government for almost 25 years, usually it doesn't happen that way.
Thank you. David, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that kind of the in-between area of, the protest, what's next policy it's really coalition building and persistence. So continuing to gather as many voices as you can. The more voices that you have, the stronger the impact will be. Then as you continue to generate that momentum and generate those coalitions, you'll be able to shake the core at a stronger level, from the local level, start, talking to the local elected officials up to the state level, up to the federal level, but also it's persistence. So continuing to have those conversations, continuing to have that outreach, continuing to have education on, those specific issue advocacy items. So, when we go back to DC this year, we're going to continue to fight for immigration and federal skilled visas and, things that we want to see happen. And until it happens, we're going to be persistent and continue to advocate for it. So I think it's just continuing to broaden your coalition base and keep advocating.
And when we talk about protests, I think when the word protest is used, I think there's automatically some imagery that comes to mind for everyone. Are there other forms of protests that we've seen or that you've seen that have proven to be effective in changing policies or behaviors?
Yeah, it's a good question. For me and what I do, normally the traditional form of protest is what you've seen. But we've seen some, innovative things. And this is from both sides of whatever argument that you want, whether it's vehicles blocking traffic, or whether it's the tractor trailers. We've seen that before. Or whether it's, I think someone glued themselves to a NBA hardwood floor recently to protest something. There's civil disruptions, and then there are things that are not civil disruptions, like, writing letters to your elected officials, speaking at city councils and things of that nature. But I do want to just say one thing. One form of protest that is not effective is withholding your vote. That is not effective, in my opinion. There are some people who don't vote. They don't get involved in the election process out of protest. Well, nothing changes. Nothing ever stays the same. It's the same people, the same thing. I'm going to withhold my vote. I would submit that type of protest is not the type of protest that we want.
I agree with the police chief. Something that I was going to say and that I've been preaching this entire time is either getting out there and running for office yourself or just vote. That's the strongest, most most impactful thing that we can do as individuals. You don't have to, this day and age, it's so easy that you can register everything online, drop something off at the ballot box, do it from your car. I don't know if the rules have changed, but I voted from my car last year. So it's just voting and is definitely extremely important, and making sure that your voice is heard, especially at the local level where, the difference can be between 1, or 20 votes. So it's definitely echo police chief words in saying that voting.
Thank you. And I often, when I asked that question, I was thinking about instances where as communities will boycott spending their dollars in certain places as a form of protest as well. And that can lead to changes within establishments, food chains, and things of that nature.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. I was trying to think of it, but the Montgomery bus boycott, to me, for those of us who study history, is the most successful protest in the history of this country. You're talking about over 1 year. I think the total may have been like 380 days. They did not ride the bus. Everyone walked. And you're talking about all 4 seasons, rainy, hot weather, to integrate the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama. The Montgomery bus boycott is without a doubt the most successful protest to policy that I can think of, because the sacrifices that were made were unbelievable. And not only the sacrifice, but the consistency. We can sacrifice and be like, you know what, I'm not going to go to this restaurant, for 2 days. It may work for that time, but that consistent sacrifice, I think, is something that we haven't seen in a very long time. And withholding those dollars means a lot to people.
In my community, I believe it was 2 summers ago, I was contacted by local media to provide some commentary on what was going on in America. But what I did, instead of taking that opportunity to do what they wanted to do, is I asked them, could they do what I wanted them to do? In that particular instance, what it was is I think that there are a lot of people who don't have either the time or the desire or the courage to go down and kind of see what's happening. And so their whole understanding of protest is often defined by media, right? And so one of the things I asked some media outlets in my community to stop doing is specifically making this one statement. As day turns to night, protest turns to riots. I've heard so many individuals who have no context of what people are in the streets for saying, I would support those people, but they're turning into riots or into rioters, right? Into looters. And it's almost as if the way the media presents that sometimes is that everyone goes into a phone booth and at one time does a circle and comes out. And all of those people who are down there voicing themselves in a very lawful way for all of the right reasons have now all become the individuals who are disrupting things. And I think that's a real opportunity. I think that's a real opportunity for media outlets to take that extra 5 to 6 seconds to explain that a little bit better, because day does turn to night, but not all protesters turn to rioters. I think there's a real opportunity there. But I want to take a second to get back to another audience question. And again, I appreciate the questions coming in from the audience. We've got, how would you suggest preparing communities for policy change, or those systems, public health, safety, prepare for them as well? So how would you suggest that we prepare communities for policy change or potential policy change?
I think it's having conversations. Exactly what we're doing here is we're talking about it. We're never going to understand what the communities want, what policy changes they want to see implemented if we don't have these conversations. So taking these conversations and having them within our circles, within our networks, and within our communities. So I think I'm a strong proponent for just having those conversations and meeting people where they're at. And then once we understand where, what they want, then it's not so much preparing that community, since they're already, it's something that comes from them. They already know what's happening. So it's so much just preparing the systems.
Yeah, I think for me, when it's a major initiative that I think will affect community at the district level or community proper, One of the things that I do is I try to do as much media about it as I can. For example, our initiative now to reduce reckless driving, speeding and racing amongst our city. We go out and we do media on it. I do the mayor's Thursday press briefing on it, and then I answer questions from the media. When it comes to policy, we actually post our policy for 15 days on our website before the policy goes into effect, and we give people an opportunity to comment, and we try to answer those. As you know, we are working towards body-worn camera pilot implementation, and so we'll be putting something on our website soon where people can ask questions, and I'm going to answer those questions via video. And we're trying to do that. But prior to that, we had 2 informational sessions, and then we had 1 actual public hearing on the subject where we heard from both sides of the equation. And so, we're learning, we're evolving. And so, we have to ask our community, how do I communicate with you? How do you want to hear this information? What's the best way to inform you of a change that may affect you? And so that's some of the things that we do here at the Madison Police Department.
Yeah, that's really important, that piece about how do you want to be communicated to? I think far too often the individual or entity in power defines that communication route, right? Like, we're going to do this at 7:30 on Thursday, one time. We might do it 2 times. And if you're there, you catch it. But really doing the groundwork to understand, in the community in which you are, when are people available? Where are people available? And what are the multiple ways that you can reach individuals? I think that's really important to establish that prior to actually needing people's voices or needing to communicate with people. Chief Barnes, we spoke a little bit briefly about the 5 things one should consider before protesting when we were prepping for this. Is that something you feel comfortable talking about today?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about it. Just for the sake of time, I think before, if you read Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, in that letter, many people may not be aware, but he's not just talking to white citizens in Birmingham. He's actually talking to a group of Black clergy who had sent him a correspondence as to, why are you here causing trouble? And he talks about what you should do or why they show up and then protest. These are the things that we do before we go anywhere to bring light to injustice. And then he goes on to talk about that threat. But one of the things that he talks about is they give people an opportunity to respond. And so I would say that if you're considering an organized protest and you're upset about whether it's voting rights, and I know that voting is certainly something that our government is taking very seriously. Thank goodness. I've been in meetings with the FBI. They are certainly have an entire task force dedicated to voting in irregularities or any type of impropriety, asking questions about what is it that you're doing to prevent this? This is the grievance that we have. Here's your opportunity to respond either in writing or in person to those particular grievances. Listening to the people who are affected and then actually getting on the ground to validate what they are going through, not just what they are feeling, because that's difficult, but actually getting out of the office and going and see how difficult it is. I recently spoke with a business owner, and in my position, people talk to me about all types of complaints, and some of them have nothing to do with police, but I listen. But I heard a business owner, and David may have some response to this, but the business owner wanted to talk to me about how tough it is for minority businesses. And it was things like parking, inequities in rent, things like how your neighbors, your business neighbors treat you, how mixed use is difficult for these type of businesses, how most Black business owners do multiple things. And so they may not be there 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. They may have to be there 12 to 8, and how the mixed use and people parking, coming home, how that's not good for their business. And I thought it was just an amazing conversation, but it led me to kind of direct the business owner to someone in the city that could help. And so that's just some ideas about what you can do before protests and give people an opportunity to have that type of dialogue.
I appreciate that. David, did you want to follow up to that? And if not, what I want to do is give you an opportunity to maybe just provide some closing thoughts, and then I'll let Chief Barnes do that as well.
Yeah, I think I'll just go ahead and give some closing remarks, just because, I agree with what Police Chief said, is that there are inequities with our minority businesses here in the city. One of our kind of, champion pillars at the chamber, we have an advocacy agenda that we release every 2 years. One of our priority pillars is to help ensure that Greater Madison remains or becomes the best place for entrepreneurs of color to own a business. Diversify the supply chain, and, diverse fund managers, and just different kind of items like that we can use to, simple things that we can do to kind of help Madison be the best place for entrepreneurs of color. So I do hear that, understand that, but it's kind of what I just want to say about that. Appreciate Madison 365 moderator Rashad for having us here. I hope our viewers today just really took something out of this, and your voice it's a powerful thing. So please use it. Go to city meetings, run for office, reach out to your local elected officials. Just really, if something's not sitting well with you, your voice is your most powerful tool. So I'd encourage you to use that. And thanks for having me here today.
I appreciate that. And I would add that when you're using your voice and reaching out to people, encourage someone else to do it as well. Chief Barnes, that way we can amplify the work. Chief Barnes, do you have any closing thoughts?
Sure. Again, I want to thank you, Rashad, for being a great moderator, a great host. Thank you, Madison 365, for the invite. Certainly, whenever you call, I will certainly be there. You have a tremendous voice in our community, and it is greatly appreciated. In 2020, the senseless murder of George Floyd at the hands of the police officer, Derek Chauvin, and it really shouldn't be the George Floyd incident. It really should be the Derek Chauvin incident. He's the violator in this case. Really shook the conscience of America. And it's unfortunate that tragedy had to bring so many people together. And as a police officer or police leader at the time, I was tasked with managing a variety of protests when I was in North Carolina at that time. To compound that problem, we were also in the midst of the Confederate statute protests, if anyone remembers or followed that in the news. And so I had this duality of being someone who had to ensure the First Amendment rights of one group of persons who I absolutely agreed with and one group of persons who I absolutely did not agree with. But I did my job as professionally and respectfully as humanly possible. But once the protest stopped and it got quiet, I waited to hear the voice of the people, and I heard nothing. I waited to hear the demands that I heard on the protest line come through my email inbox, and I heard nothing. And I said, well, what is it about this system that makes people not even want to engage with us after something that shook the conscience and united a people? And so I began to do a little research myself, and I found the Edmund Pettus Bridge Bloody Sunday incident. And I had an opportunity to take some time off, and I went to Selma, Alabama in the middle of August. Myself, a police chief, one of my best friends in Dallas, Texas, or Arlington, Texas, and another good friend of mine who was a police officer in Sacramento who was just coming off of, I believe it was Laquan McDonald shooting in Sacramento. So we were all exhausted. And instead of taking a family vacation, we all went to Montgomery, Alabama, and we walked across that Edmund Pettus Bridge. We spent some time at Brown AME, and then we made the decision to walk from Selma to Montgomery. That's 54 miles. Took us 2.5 days to do it. We had an opportunity to reflect on what it is that people want. Why do people protest? And there were 3 things that we all really heard at the exact same time through our reflection. And that was, I see you, I hear you, and I'm accountable to you. And I think that's so very, very important. I think every leader ought to have a picture in their office of their community or of their children, so you never forget who you are actually accountable to. And so as a police chief, it's my responsibility to make sure that, hey, we might not always agree on things. And certainly we may not always know the impact of our policy decisions before we make them. But in some cases, we have to move forward. We have to ensure that we're doing the right thing for our community. So again, thank you for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you. And hopefully we can keep this conversation going.
I appreciate the both of you. I appreciate everyone who took time out of their busy schedules and lives to join us today. And those of you who were able to submit questions, thank you. The staff at Madison 365, those of you who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to get things set up, to get things to going, to maintain the things throughout the conference. Thank you as well. We are so humbled and appreciate all of your efforts. And then what I'd like to do now is bring on Henry Sanders, a man who I continually say is doing more to raise the profile, the spirits, and the love for minority professionals in the state of Wisconsin than anybody else I know. So Henry, we'll let you close up the conference, brother. Really appreciate and love you.
Well, I appreciate you. I love you too, brother. And I love all of you, Chief, and also David. Thank you for doing this panel for us. It was very enlightening. And I actually love, Chief, hearing you and Savion talk and agree on things about what's going on. So that was very, very powerful for me to hear. So audience, thank you so much for joining us for 2 days. We know you're busy. Maybe you couldn't join us for a whole 2 days, but I hope you got to see some of the wonderful talent we have in the state, some of the leaders we have, and some of the thought leaders that we have. I hope you enjoyed it. And I want to thank really a special shout out to our presenting sponsor, Park Bank. Thank you for so much for supporting us for this summit, being a presenting sponsor, thanking us for supporting us for our Connect Black, and also supporting us for our Real Talk podcast. So thank you so much. Thanks again for joining us. Make sure you come back and join us for our Women's Summit in June. And you all take care and have a blessed weekend. Thank you.
This is 365 Media.